Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. I'm Ben, and about 8 months ago, I traded my Gen 3 Kawasaki KLR650 for its sort of closest competitor, the 2018 Suzuki DR650 that I've been modifying, riding, and actually comparing to another bike that I purchased at the beginning of the season, which is the Honda XR650L. Now that I've had some time to ride these new bikes and think back on the KLR650, I decided to put together a list of the things that I miss about the old KLR650. Today we're going to go over that list, and at the end I'll tell you whether or not I think that trading that KLR for the DR650 and purchasing the XR650 was a smart move, and if I'm happier with the new bikes now, especially with the mods that I've been putting on them, or if I think maybe I would have been a little bit better off keeping the KLR. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around and we'll get into it. While there are some rather specific things about each one of these motorcycles that I think it definitely takes some seat time to really completely understand. Back in the day when I was a DRZ400 owner looking for a more road-oriented dual sport or possibly even an adventure bike, I think I understood well enough that going with a bike like a KLR650 was certainly going to have some downfalls, but I also knew that there were a lot of things that I really liked about that bike that seemed like they'd be pretty hard to replicate on a bike like a DR or an XR. And if you guys are unfamiliar, that sort of is the basis for the XR and the DR builds. While I'm definitely happy with a lot of the features and specs that came along with both the DR and the XR, there were a lot of things that I really liked about the KLR, and that's essentially why I went with it back in the day over the DR650 that I almost purchased instead of that first Gen 2 that I bought. And that I think is kind of the basis behind this video and behind this whole entire experiment that I've been doing this summer. Is if you're somebody that's looking at these three bikes and you like the on-road sort of adventure side of the KLR, but you're looking for something a little bit more off-road oriented, if you can buy the off-road oriented bikes and sort of mod them out to be close enough to the comforts of the KLR 650 to make it make more sense to buy those. And again, that's sort of what we're going to go over at the end, but let's get into the list and see what it is that I'm missing about these KLRs, even though I've got these new bikes that should be better for me in theory. So the first thing on my list is actually probably the biggest reason that I decided to go with the Gen 2 back in the day over the DR650, and that is the awesome wind protection that the KLR 650s have. And I know there are a lot of you guys out there that really kind of turn your nose up at wind protection, and I totally understand that if you're somebody that doesn't need to do a lot of road riding or just really doesn't care about the road riding aspect, obviously a stock DR or a stock XR is going to be a far better choice. But for me, somebody that was used to riding sport bikes that had some amount of wind protection and some amount of, well, natural on-road type feel, the KLR 650 just seemed like it was going to be a better option, and it seemed like it would be really hard to replicate that on a DR and XR. I always knew you could slap any old universal windscreen on each of them, and to be honest, a large universal windscreen would probably provide me with much better wind protection than either the Hemisphere Off-Road Rally windscreen on the XR or the universal GPS bar / windscreen on the DR650. Of course, I went with those options just because I liked how they looked over a standard windscreen, but to be honest, that really was kind of why I decided to go with the KLR, is that I figured no matter what I did with it, even if I wanted to add a little bit more wind protection to it, it would still look a little bit more natural and a little bit more like an adventure bike. But of course, even beyond that, the KLR just has a lot more sort of lower body wind protection, and you don't really realize that, I think, until you ride them. But especially with the tiny little stock gas tanks on both the XR and the DR, there really just isn't a whole lot of protection for your lower body. And if you're somebody that only rides in warm climates and never wants to go out when it's cold, then I think that's totally fine, and maybe even kind of a welcome thing. I've heard a lot of people say that they really appreciate the airflow, especially for the hot summer months, without a windshield at all. If that's you, that's great, but for me, somebody who wants to ride basically all year round, but even just in slightly colder months, it definitely is nice to have that extra wind protection, and you just feel a lot more comfortable further into the cooler riding season. And if you guys are unfamiliar, I live in central Wisconsin, and if I want to ride all year round, that means that I sometimes end up riding when it's snowing or when it's 20 or 30 degrees out. In fact, last season I took my little TW200 out on the freeway when it was 0 degrees out. So for me, wind protection definitely is important. And as much as I feel like I have improved both the XR and the DR, there still just really is no comparison. The nice thing about the XR650L is those scoops that kind of come off of the tank and are supposed to sort of scoop air into the engine compartment. They actually end up giving me a bit of a wind block for my lower body, which is certainly helpful. And I was planning on taking a ride this week. We've just been getting snowstorm after snowstorm though, so I haven't been able to get a chance to do that. But I am pretty interested to see how exactly the two compare, especially versus what I remember about the KLR. But I think even though I can sort of make do, there's still really no comparison. The Gen 3 especially has vastly superior wind protection, especially after I installed the 3D Cycle Parts windshield riser. It just has such a nice big clean air pocket, and it really does work great on the highway. The next thing on the list is sort of the backside of the wind protection, and that is sort of where you're looking when you're sitting on the bike, sort of the cockpit area. And on bikes like the XR and the DR, without any of the modifications that I made, there really just isn't a whole lot of place to put anything. Sure, you could mount a GPS way down almost in your lap on the handlebars, but for me, and I think for most riders, that's not really the ideal place to put something like that. The best place to have any sort of navigation is, well, as close to your line of sight as possible, so basically just right down below where you need to look on the road. And on bikes like the Gen 2 KLR650, you did need to do a little bit of a modification, but definitely a worthwhile one, and that was the KLR Dash. I loved having the spot for my phone and my GPS. Eventually, I think it just went to just a GPS, and then on the Gen 3, it basically came stock with a lot more room to put adventure type modifications. There was a bar specifically for a GPS, and then once I got my windshield stood up, there was even more, and the riser that I had back then actually had a spot to put a GPS on. Beyond that, there was just lots of other space to put things like the Thermobob 3 mod with the little temperature display. There's also plenty of room for a tachometer or a voltmeter. I had a switch on the left hand side for my heated grips, and a 12-volt socket with a USB port stuck into it on the right side. And if I wanted to put a whole bunch more stuff on there, there was just tons and tons and tons of room. It was also just sort of a nice place to be and to look at. You just kind of not only felt protected from the wind, but you felt like you're just sort of sitting down in the bike a bit. And if you haven't ever been on one of those bikes, or if you're somebody that again rides in kind of hot climates and doesn't want all that there, I can definitely see where you would like having the open cockpit on an XR or a DR, but if you try to put any sort of mods on those bikes, you really just kind of run out of room quickly. And I'm kind of finding that even with the Hemisphere Off-Road Rally Dash, with my, well, rather large screen that I've got on it, and the DR650 as well with that GPS bar, there just isn't a whole lot of room for anything else. Partially, that is my fault with my large screens, but I am finding that I really like them. So if that's what I want on my bike, then that's what I want on my bike, and I need to find a spot for the rest of the stuff, and that is proving to be a little bit difficult. But honestly, even aside from just having enough room to put stuff, it's just kind of nice to be on a bike like that, especially out on the road. And while there certainly are some nice things about keeping it a little bit lower profile and a bit cleaner, I do kind of miss having that nice area to be sort of in when I'm riding. The next thing on my list is even a little bit closer to the rider still, and is actually a big reason that I went with that Gen 2 KLR650 initially over the DR650, and that is the gigantic fuel tank. KLRs have always had over 6 gallons of fuel capacity, and bikes like my DR650 only hold about just about half of that at 3.4 gallons, where the XR650 holds an embarrassingly low 2.8 gallons, which means with its rather lackluster fuel consumption on the rides that I like to take up north, which are about an hour away, I have to stop anywhere from 2 to 3 times to refuel. And if you guys watched that very first adventure that I took it out on, I knew that it was going to be bad coming into it, but I didn't know that I would have to flip to reserve after just 74 miles. And since then, since I've been riding it a little bit harder and went down to a 14-tooth sprocket, I'm noticing that the fuel consumption is even worse, and sometimes I only get 64 miles out of it before I have to flip it to reserve. Obviously, being able to carry less capacity helps keep the XR's weight down to just 346 pounds, where The Gen 3 KLR is 460, but of course that doesn't help much if you're stranded on a back road somewhere without any fuel. And of course, I know I could add larger fuel tanks to both the DR and the XR, which I may still do at some point, but to be honest, I really just like the stock fuel tanks. I think they look beautiful. I think they add a lot to the bike, especially the XR, but they certainly are a bit inconvenient when you're trying to ride these bikes like adventure bikes. The other thing that I miss about the KLR's fuel tank, which is sort of compounded by the fact that, again, I may need to fill up 2 or 3 times anytime that I want to take these bikes out, is the fact that the KLR's fuel cap, you just stuck the key down in, gave it a twist, and then it would just hinge back at you. You didn't have to worry about dropping it on the floor or getting any dirt on it and having that end up then in the tank. Where on the DR and the XR, anytime that I take the fuel caps off, I then have to find a safe space to put them where they're not going to end up dirty or possibly get knocked off and hit the ground. I know it is kind of a small thing, but it is certainly something that I miss about the KLR. The next thing that I find myself missing on the new DR and the XR is the fact that the rider triangle and ergonomics on the KLRs were just a little bit more cruiser-ish, a little bit more adventure type. You kind of sat down in the bikes a little bit more, where on the DR and the XR, you're sort of sitting on them a little bit closer to a dirt bike. I did make modifications to both KLRs and to the new bikes with different foot peg brackets, different handlebar risers, and different bars. The XR and the DR, of course, also have seat concept seats, which definitely bump up the level of comfort. But even still, with all of that in slightly better positions than stock, I've got to say both the Gen 2 and I think especially the Gen 3 just felt a bit more like an adventure bike and were just a little bit more relaxed. They still did do, well, okay off-road, and I think if I could go back to that same rider triangle and same ergonomics that the KLR had and somehow change the DR and the XR so they would match it, I think I probably would go for it. Again, I might lose some off-road ability, but I do really find myself kind of missing that nice comfy feel that the KLR had. Now this next thing is sort of along the same lines, but kind of for a different reason, and it is certainly something that I don't miss when I'm off-road with the XR or the DR, but that's actually the weight and sort of big ADV-ish type feel that both the weight and the wheelbase of the KLRs kind of provided. It definitely, again, isn't something that's great for off-road riding, but when you are on the freeway or even just on the county back roads, it's just kind of nice to be on a big, solid feeling bike that doesn't quite get as blown around as easily as bikes like the XR and the DR. Both of them have a lot more ground clearance, which is great. Both of them give you a bit more of a vantage point when you're off-road. But when you're on the road, that extra height and sitting more on the bike than in the bike like you do with the KLR, I think also coupled with the sort of shorter wheelbases, it just makes you feel like you're riding a dirt bike on the highway, where when you're on the KLR, sure, it still feels like an old thumper, but it feels like an old thumper that's, well, designed to be on the high-speed roads. And while, oddly enough, I find that the XR and the DR both seem to be happier from a motor and transmission standpoint on the highway, the bikes themselves, even with my added wind protection, still feel like, well, dirt bikes on the highway. So even though I don't miss it off the road, I definitely do find myself missing it on road. Now this next thing I think is easy enough to add, and it is actually one of the next things that I'll be adding to both the XR and the DR, although the DR sort of has this, but that is the fact that both the Gen 2 and the Gen 3, and the Gen 3 was actually much nicer for this, they have not only a spot to put luggage on the back, you've got the nice big racks, but they also have a nice grab handle to hang onto, and especially with a giant 460-pound monster, when you're riding around off-road, you certainly need a place to hang onto once you're sort of finding yourself in a spot that you need to get off the bike and maybe manipulate it around because you maybe rode down a trail that you shouldn't have. And while a bike like the XR650L weighs much, much less, it still would be really nice to have a place to hang onto on the back. I find myself grabbing onto the signal light bracket most of the time, which is certainly not the right place to be grabbing onto. So I'm really looking forward to getting a rack on that bike, just for the simple standpoint that I'll actually have a place to grab onto when I need to move the bike around. The DR650 does have some really, really nice grab handles, but of course it doesn't have any sort of luggage rack to begin with. And if you're somebody that likes to do some sort of longer adventures, I have been able to sort of figure my way around it with the big Rover hydration vest backpack that I wear every time that I go out. But it still would be really nice to just have a place to throw things, to basically get that weight off of my back. Now, this next thing is one that I don't think you could really understand until you've actually ridden all three of these bikes, or at least been around all three when they're running, and that is not only the sound but also the feeling that you get from the motor in the KLR. And being that they're all big bore single cylinder thumpers, you would think that they'd be similar enough that I wouldn't miss it. And while they are kind of adjacent, they're not really all that similar. And even the XR and the DR have a really very different kind of sound and feeling to them. I think a lot of it has to do with how they rev up, but it is also just sort of the feeling you get through the contact points and also the audible sound itself. And I haven't really done anything with either the intake or the exhaust on either the XR or the DR. So maybe when I go to put on my aftermarket pipes and de-snorkel them and maybe do a few carburetor mods, this will improve, and who knows, maybe I'll even like it better. But with the FMF pipe that came on my Gen 2 and the Lex pipe that I put on the Gen 3, and with both of those bikes de-snorkeled, they really just had kind of a mean, nice growl to them. They also just had kind of a good feeling to them, and there are certain times, especially a little bit higher up on the RPMs when you're on the freeway, that the vibrations that you pick up through the contact points aren't the nicest, but I really did enjoy just sort of railing that bike. It definitely just made a cool sound and was a cool feeling, and I really, really do just miss that about those motorcycles. Of course, the DR and the XR are both quite a bit faster and certainly have the ability to pick the front wheels up a lot easier, which is far superior for off-road riding. But I don't know, I just miss the KLR chug, even if maybe it was all talk. The next thing on the list is a little bit more tangible and easier to see, and makes it much easier to see at night, and that is the headlight. The Gen 2 KLR, it basically stole its headlight from Kawasaki sport bikes, but it certainly, I think, was a step up aesthetically anyway from the sort of boring generic rectangle glass headlights on both the XR and the DR. It did certainly require some help with the light output, which is why I put a set of LED bulbs in it and added some auxiliary lights, but nothing, I think, has been able to compare to the beautiful stock headlight that the Gen 3 KLR has. It definitely works well as far as the low beam. The high beam was, well, certainly nice for a high beam, but I like to have a little bit more fill for the sides, especially with all the deer running around here. So I added some auxiliary lights to that bike, and with the Tusk crash bars that I had on there and the little brackets that I found that just placed them so perfectly next to the stock headlight, I just have never had anything that has worked as well and looked near as cool. I've tried to sort of replicate that on both the XR and the DR with some upgraded LED bulbs and some auxiliary lights, but it still just is nowhere near as nice as the Gen 3, both the looks and the actual light output. I just miss that about that bike. I think it looked great, it worked great, and I do really miss it. And that sort of ties into the very last thing on my list, and that is just the look, especially of the Gen 3. I really did like how my Gen 2 looked once I had the KLR dash on it and all my crash protection and the auxiliary lights. It really looked like a cool mix between an adventure bike and a dual sport, and that is sort of what I'm going for with both the XR and the DR. I really am liking how the XR turned out. The DR650, I'm not displeased with how it looks with the windshield, but initially my plan with that bike was to put a full rally tower on it. Now things have gotten a little bit tighter money-wise around here since I've taken the leap to make this my full-time job, and basically I'm just a little bit too nervous at this point to drop thousands of dollars on something that probably isn't really going to help anything other than, well, my own personal view of the bike itself. And that's kind of why I decided to try the cheaper method first. I may still go with a full rally tower eventually someday, but as of right now, I gotta say, I really do like how the XR looks. The DR, I think, is coming along and does look good from certain angles, but none of them, I think, look near as adventure dual sport-ish as the Gen 3 KLR. I think that was one of the most beautiful bikes that I've ever owned, and if you're not somebody that enjoys KLRs or enjoys riding KLRs, I think it's pretty easy to look at that bike and think that it's a big ugly pig, but if you've seen them in person, and especially if you've seen one that's been modded, especially I think anyways, the way that my Gen 3 was, it really is just a very cool looking adventure bike. And in some aspects, I almost think it looks better than the Tenere 700. And of course, everybody has their own opinion of what a beautiful motorcycle looks like. And I'm not saying more beautiful than any of the new adventure bikes that are coming out today. It definitely had some sort of goofy aspects to it and some, well, sort of not so great angles. But for the majority of the time that I owned that bike after it was modded, I just loved to stand and look at it. I loved the new rally fairing that they designed. The back half of it, I think, was definitely better looking than the Gen 2. I think if it was a little bit slimmer, it would maybe look a little bit cooler, and a lot of that is what I like about the DR650. It is just a very slim bike. And even the XR, I think, is a really beautiful bike from a lot of different angles, but neither of them look as sort of rally-ish as the KLR did, and maybe I'll be able to change that with a few more mods, but I really did just enjoy looking at the Gen 3, and I do miss not having it in the garage. Well, here we are, the end of the video, and the point in time that I have to tell you whether or not I think I made a big mistake or whether I'm really happy with my new motorcycles. And I think if you guys have been following along with the adventures this summer, it's pretty easy to tell that I really have been enjoying both the XR and the DR. And as much as I've said that there are a lot of things in this video that I miss about the KLR, the way that I've got both the DR and the XR modded and the mods that I still have planned, I think are going to make both bikes a much better option for the type of riding that I want to do. The KLRs were definitely more than enough to sort of get the job done, but I'm finding that on a lot of the same trails that I used to ride the KLRs down, I just have a lot more fun with the XR and the DR, and I don't really think that's because the KLR is a bad bike or that it's not up to the job of off-roading. I think it does a great job of off-roading for the type of off-roading that it was intended to do. And I think if I would have upgraded the suspension on either the Gen 2 or the Gen 3, I think it really would have made them both much better bikes off-road. And I do sort of regret not doing that, but there's really just no way to get around that extra weight and no way to get around the power-to-weight ratio. The XR and the DR are just miles ahead of the KLR in both of those categories, and it just makes them so much more fun to ride off-road. It makes them so much easier to ride off-road, and it makes them a lot more playful. Both bikes are so much easier, albeit with a little bit of help from the 14-tooth sprocket, of course, to pull the front end up and just ride over whatever type of obstacle that I need to get across in the trail. And while sure, I could have bumped my way through on the old KLRs, I like to ride at a little bit faster of a pace, and both the XR and the DR allow me to do that. The XR, I think, a little bit more so than the DR. I have sort of found the limits of the suspension on the DR, and that's why I believe that I have some suspension lined up to test out next season, so I'm pretty excited about that. I think that will bring that bike a little bit more in line with the off-road ability of the XR, but both of them in general, I think, while they don't measure up to a lot of the on-road riding aspects as far as kind of the comfort side of things go, they really do a great job, or at least a good enough job, of riding on the paved surfaces. I have a lot of fun in the corners with both of those because of the power to weight ratio. I think I enjoy them more on the corners, and because of the way that they're set up, they just seem, even with the 14-tooth sprockets, to be able to do highway speeds much more comfortably. Sure, they are a little bit higher up and you get blown around a little bit more and you don't have as nice a wind protection, but they just seem to have a little bit more snap from single track riding all the way up to freeway riding, and I really have been enjoying that about both of them. Again, that's nothing that I didn't really understand or know back when I decided to go with the KLR, so I'm not trying to rip on those bikes. It seems like a lot of people think that when I'm saying, these sort of negative things about any one of these bikes, that I'm personally attacking their motorcycle and their motorcycle decisions and aspirations. But that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm really just trying to help those who are interested in these bikes, and we're sort of trying to make the same type of decisions that I had to make back when I was riding that DRZ400 and looking for my next motorcycle that was hopefully going to be a little bit more on-road oriented. So I think if you're somebody that really wants to ride fast, possibly ride some single track, needs to do a bit of highway riding, I think you can pretty easily mod either a DR or an XR to fit those type of riding needs. I really have been enjoying riding them out on the freeway, and I've definitely been enjoying them off-road. I think if you're somebody that maybe doesn't have single track aspirations and wants something that feels a little bit more solid and that is just set up a little bit better for adventure type riding from the factory, then I think there really isn't anything that is going to be better, at least that I've ridden to date, than a KLR 650. I mean, there's just so many great things about that bike for entry-level type riders, or even somebody that has been riding for years and years and years and just wants an old faithful bike to hop on and go out and explore this beautiful world that God created for us to enjoy. So if that's something that you can do on your KLR or your DR or your XR, please get out and do that as much as you can. You never know how much time you have left on this planet, and I don't think there's near enough time to sit and argue about which motorcycle is best. I think our time is best spent just enjoying them, and that's why I've been trying to put videos together like this for the last 8 years, to try to help people decide what bike is best for them. And to be honest, I think the best way to figure that out is to just get out and ride different bikes. And while it may be sort of sad to see bikes come and go, it's definitely nice to be able to get on new bikes and have new experiences, and I really have been enjoying that. So thanks to all of you guys who have been making that possible, especially huge thanks to my channel members. Thanks to everybody who has supported the channel over the years, just through views or comments or likes. That all really does mean a lot to me, and it definitely helps. But of course, you guys that use my affiliate links to make your gear purchases also really help continue to literally fund this channel and my adventures. So huge thanks to all of you guys. Take care, stay safe, stay swanky, God bless, get out, enjoy this beautiful world any chance you get, and we'll catch you on the next one.